Hello, it's Karen at the Cool Tools Studio, and I'm here today to share a really fun project with you guys. I'm going to be using the new formula of FS999 to make an all-clay cloisonné. Before we dive right in, let's take a minute to talk about how cloisonnés are traditionally done and how we'll be using metal clay to simulate that technique. Cloisonnés are typically done by fusing really thin fine silver wire into a base coat of enamel that's been fired on top of either fine silver or copper. While I love cloisonné and I think the finish technique is absolutely beautiful, it's always really nerve-wracking to fire those wires in. They can either fall over on you and fuse into your base coat, or you can melt them if you leave them in too long. On the other hand, if you don't fire them long enough, they'll pop off on you while you're enameling. We're going to skip all the drama and stress by making our cloisonné fully out of clay. Here's what we're going to need to make the fine silver element that we are going to enamel. I've got a clay hydrator, some cool slip, and some new formula FS999 clay, both lump and then paste in a syringe. I've got a work surface, some extra Teflon cards, an ultra clay pick, some tweezers, a 6-inch ruler, and a scalpel. I also have a circle template and some clay thickness rolling frames. I have a self-healing cutting mat and a clay roller. I'm also going to be using a wick away with a brush and some sanding tools. Let's get started. We're going to begin by making the strips that are going to act as our cloisonné wires. And I'm going to be rolling clay to 2 cards thickness, but I'm going to be doing so on top of an extra Teflon work surface. That way I can move it easily. I'm going to start with some cool slip. And that's plenty for both my surface and my roller. I'm going to grab a little piece of FS999 and I'm going to roll it down to 2 cards thickness, but I'm going to start with 4. And since I'm going for a long kind of strip form, I'm going to kind of start it as a general log. And then I'm going to move on to 2. A little extra there. All right. And then I'm just going to trim up my edges a little bit, that way I'm not drying extra clay and I'm giving myself a nice general rectangle shape that I can cut strips from. Alright, so I'm going to move the rest of this clay into my hydrator to keep it nice and moist, and then I'm going to move this strip into the clay dehydrator. And since it's thin, it's not going to take long to dry. I'm probably going to be drying it for around 5 minutes, and since it is so thin, I'm also going to check it and flip it occasionally as it dries. So now that I have my piece dried, I'm going to move over to the self-healing cutting mat to cut my strips. I'm going to clear this out of the way. And then, just like the previous recipe of FS999, this clay is incredibly flexible when dried with heat. So it's going to be perfect for bending these kind of simulation cloisonné wires. I'm going to start by truing up my edge there, and the grids on these are really nice for helping with that, to give myself a nice clean edge to start my strips with. And I'm cutting these dry because I like that when the clay is dry, you can get a nice crisp edge when you cut with a scalpel, and you don't have to worry about damaging the surface of the clay. So I'll reconstitute that piece. And I'm shooting to cut my strips around 2 millimeters. I'm just kind of eyeballing, and they don't have to be exactly the same because at a later point we'll be sanding them and we'll even things up then. So I have my 3 strips, and then I'm going to cut a slightly larger strip and clean up that other side, and I will be using a portion of this as a hidden bail on the back of my piece. So I have 3 strips for my wire and then 1 piece for the back of my bail. I like to cut the length that I'm going to be using to make my petals all at once. That way I know they'll be generally the same. And for this project I used around 1 inch. So got that guy, and then I'm just going to use it to kind of line up an eyeball. And I'm going to be cutting 11 1-inch pieces. So I have my 11 pieces here, and then I've got a remainder that I'm also going to use to make the little circle element in the center of my petals. And then here's the strip for the bail, and I'm going to cut that to be maybe 3/4 of an inch. You can trim it again later if you need to. And now I'm going to move back over to my work surface. So now that I have my strips, I'm going to make my petals. And this clay joins amazingly well with just a tiny dab of water. So I'm going to start by connecting the ends, just a little dab, and bending it on itself, and then just a little bit of pressure. And just like that, you've got your petal. And you can either leave it rounded there. In this project, I kind of gave the end a little pinch, and that's how I made my petal. And I'm just going to repeat that for 11 more to make my flower. So the wick away is a really great tool to help you control your liquid on your brush and keep things from getting messy. So I've got my 11 petals, and they're a little bit different. It's an organic flower. I think it's nice sometimes to have things look natural. So don't worry too much about fussing them so they're all exactly the same. And I've got a little extra here that I'm going to just really simply wrap around my clay pick to do the center. And looks like I'll need about that much, so I'm going to trim it. And you could do this around anything round if you want it a little bit larger. And again, I'm just going to dampen those ends. And kind of roll them to meet. So there's my circle, that's going to be my center. All right. So now I'm going to grab some tweezers just because I find it's easier to move things with those. And I'm going to arrange my petals around my center. All right, so that's generally where things are going to be. And I'm going to start connecting these wires by, again, just a touch of water, but I'm going to connect them at the outside of their petals first. That way I'll establish a shape and form before coming in and connecting here. Because if we re-soften these seams, they might get a little loose, but if we already have them connected out here, it'll still hold its shape. Kind of nudging them together as I go. A little too much water. Then it really only takes a dab. It's amazing how well this clay joins with water. And by skipping the paste at this part, we're really keeping things nice and clean and crisp. So now that I have my flower, I'm going to be making the frame that's going to go around the enamel. And I'm rolling on top of another piece of extra Teflon here. And I'm doing that so when I move my shape, I'm not going to distort anything. And I started off with Cool Slip again. And I'm going to be rolling to 3 cards thick. Grab a nugget of clay. This will be plenty. Let's get that guy out of the way. Oops. Just all over the place. Okay, so I'm going to be cutting the inside of my frame first, and I'm going to pick a size circle that I think looks nice. I like a lot of blue background in this piece, but if you want it to be more close, you could pick a smaller size. I think that's about right. So I'm going to cut out the inside of my frame here. And then, just to make things a little more manageable, I'm going to trim the edges too, but not too close because I know I need to have the perimeter of my frame too. So I'm going to set that aside and pull in another extra surface, and I'm going to roll another piece 3 cards thick for the back of this piece. So here's another piece, it's 3 cards thick, and I'm just going to again kind of do a quick general trimming, and I'm going to laminate this top piece on top of this back piece. And I'm going to remove the center first. And I'm going to apply just a touch of water. And then I'm going to take this, I'm going to flip it. Might take some peeping. I'm going to position it on top of the other piece, and then I'm going to peel this back. So now I'm going to bring my circle template back, and I'm going to cut the outside edge. And again, you could do a larger border if you'd like. I'm going to go with a thinner one for this piece. And then remove the excess. So I use this method of lamination, that way I didn't have to worry about trying to line up my outside edges, and I got a nice, smooth, even outside edge there without a seam. So now I'm going to dry this before I add the flower. The new FS999 formula was designed with an emphasis on elasticity and ability to hold moisture to address some concerns that customers were reporting. As a result, the clay has an amazing workability, and you can design without having to worry about cracks. On the other hand, you need to make sure that you thoroughly dry your clay before firing. I recommend flipping it as it dries to make sure it dries thoroughly and flatly. So I've dried my frame, and now I'm going to place my flower into it. And I dried the frame before I added the flower because it's easier to join dried clay to dried clay. And it's going to move it over. And kind of place it and scoot it with the tweezers. Come a little more this way. All right, I like that. So now I'm again just going to use a touch of water to join the flower to the back piece. And I'm starting on these outside edges. And then I'm just going to kind of work my way in. And again, it doesn't take a ton of water. We're going to go around the outside all the way, and then I'm going to come in on the inside. I've attached these petals, and now I'm going to flip my piece over and I'm going to attach the bail. And I'm going to give this a gentle curve just with my paintbrush because I have it handy, but you could use anything round. I'm going to dampen my ends, just a little bit of water, and I've got some FS999 in a syringe. Just putting a little bit. You can add more once it's placed if you need to. And if you've got a particular side you want facing up, you can check it. I don't really mind where it is. Tap down a little bit on the ends there, and then come back in with a brush to try to even things out. And the reason why I use syringe on this connection, but not the others, is because I'm joining a kind of curve to a flat, and the extra body there is helping to smooth that transition. I'm going to add just a touch more to again kind of make that a more gradual, smooth transition from back to bail. And then once this dries, I'll sand it more even with a sanding sponge as well. Alright, so I'm going to apply the same treatment to the top there, just a bit more to ease things out. And then I'm also just going to run a touch of water on the inside there to make sure it's a nice strong joint. All right, since I added a little bit of moisture back to this piece, I'm going to allow it to dry again before I move on to sanding. So my piece is dry and I'm ready to sand it. And I'm going to begin by sanding the wires flush with this outside edge. And to do so, I'm going to flip my piece upside down onto some sandpaper and move in circular motions. And I'm starting with 320 grit, and I'm going to work my way down to 800 to give myself a really nice smooth surface. And I'm doing it this way instead of with sanding sponges, so I'll get a nice flat face. The sponges will have a little bit too much give, and you'll end up getting curved edges. So I'm going to sand this, and then I'll catch up with you guys. So I'm wrapping up with my 800 here. And now I'm ready to move on to sanding sponges to clean up the edges and the back. You don't have a ton of cleanup to do since you laminated them and cut them together, but we're just going to do a little bit of cleanup to smooth out the surface. When your piece is sanded and you go to fire it, you're going to be firing it in a silica dish with alumina hydrate in it. I'm not placing it flat against a kiln shelf since it has this bail that could be smooshed. So I'm just going to set it in the alumina hydrate. When you fire the fine silver clay, you're going to fire it at 1650 for 2 hours. I have another piece here that I've already fired and brought to a polish. You want to tumble your pieces before you apply enamel, that way the enamel has a nice gem-like quality. If you can't quite get the shot into those smaller spaces while you're tumbling, you can use a ball burnisher to bring them up to a shine. Not only did I tumble and burnish my piece prior to applying enamel, but I also cleaned it thoroughly with some surfactant on a toothbrush. I used a toothbrush so I could help it get in those low areas. I rinsed it thoroughly, and now we're set to enamel. I've got this ready to go. Let's take a look at what we need to enamel. I've got some clear fire in a spray bottle to apply it with, some surfactant, a sifter, a pipette, and a brush. I've got a palette that I've loaded up with some enamels. I'm going to be working with clear for silver, soft yellow, egg yellow, mandarin orange, and Prussian blue. I've got some stones and some diamond hand laps for finishing. All right, let's get going with the enamel. For this project, you're going to be firing your enamel at 1450. I've already had my kiln heating, and that's actually what that clicking noise has been, so I'm up to temp and I'm ready to start enameling. I'm going to begin with a counter enamel. And I've got some clear fire that's been mixed at 50-50 ratio with some water in a spray bottle here. I'm just gonna mist it on. Kind of crooked there. And then we're gonna be wet packing the front, but since this is just one solid color and we're not filling cells, we're just gonna sift onto the back. And I'm gonna kind of have it at an angle there so I can get enamel underneath the bail. Make sure we come out to the edges. And you don't want to cake it on, but you want a reasonably thick layer since you're gonna have quite a bit of enamel on the other side. So then I'm just gonna use the brush to kind of dust off and mix in and smooth out any extra enamel on the bail here. All right, I'm going to allow this to dry and fire it in my kiln. My counter enamel's been fired and this piece is cooled, so I'm ready to move on to the wet packing. So the enamels that I have in this dish have already been washed or sized, and what that just means is that they're going to be their most translucent and brightest. The bigger particles are the most pure in color, so I've removed the smaller enamel particles. We have another video up that will show you how to do that. I'm going to be starting with clear for silver as my base coat, and I'm doing that because warm colors tend to turn kind of brown over silver, so this is going to help them stay nice and bright. Since we're wet packing, I'm going to apply a little bit of water with a pipette. And we're shooting for that damp sand consistency. And you want to be able to pick it up on your brush without it running off on you. And I'm just going to be placing a thin layer of it. Oh, maybe a little more water actually. There we go. A thin layer of it into my cells that I've made here. And then once I fire this layer, I'll be ready to start applying color. So I have a thin layer of clear for silver down, and I'm going to allow this to dry and then fire it. So I have my clear for silver base coat fired on, and I'm ready to start adding color. I like to start with the smaller areas and work my way out. I find it's easier if you accidentally get some stray pieces to nudge them back into place when you start small. So I'll pick up a little bit of orange. I'm going to encourage it into that cell. Okay. And then there are some other smaller places between the petals here that's going to have blue enamel. So I'm going to move on to those next. And I'm just kind of picking up with the brush, but also using it to kind of coax and push the enamel in. All right. So I'm going to move on to the petal that's in between those two. And I started with the mandarin orange close to the center. And then blended my way out to the warmer egg yellow. A little more moisture. And then put soft yellow on the very tip. Once I get all three of these colors placed, I'm going to spend some time with just a slightly damp brush to kind of work back and forth. So I'm packing this very thinly, and that, alongside making sure your pieces are very dry before you fire them, will keep you from having air bubbles in your enamel. So I'm going to keep packing this first layer, and we'll catch back up when I'm closer to the end. So here I have my first layer of enamel packed. And again, you want to make sure you allow it to thoroughly dry before you fire, otherwise your blue could kind of pop up and land in your yellow on you. You can either leave it on top of your kiln or intermittently put your piece in the kiln and pull it out if you want to speed up the drying process. I'm going to fire this, and we'll take a look at what it looks like. I fired my first layer of enamel, and you can kind of tell that I pulled it out when part of it was still orange peel. This orange fires at a higher temperature than the other colors, and I didn't want to overfire my blues and my yellows, so I pulled it then. You'll be evening out the surface when you stone and sand, so you're able to pull things out at orange peel. I'm ready to pack on my second layer, and depending on how thick you pack, this is going to take 2 to 3 more coats. I'm just going to keep enameling, and we'll catch back up when I'm ready to stone this piece. So I have my piece here with my enamel packed up to the level of my metal, so I'm ready to begin stoning and sanding. If you've seen me stone and sand before, I'm going to be doing things a little bit differently than I have before. I'm still going to start off with the stones to remove a majority of the enamel from the metal surface, but I'm going to move on to using these diamond hand laps instead of wet dry sandpaper. I wish somebody would have told me about these years ago. They're really ergonomical and feel much better than trying to pinch sandpaper while you're working. They also make really quick work of the project, and they're totally worth the investment. I'm going to move over to the sink and get going with the stones. So I'm going to be using the stones and the diamond hand laps as well underwater, and this is going to keep you from inhaling harmful glass particulates and also act as a lubricant. We're going to start with just a touch of water and our 120 grit stone. And I'm going to be working in a circular motion. As I said, we're going to use the 120 grit stone to remove most of the enamel, and then I'm going to move on to the 240 grit stone. After that, we'll move on to the diamond hand laps, and we'll catch back up then. So I'm moving on from the stones to the diamond hand lap, and I'm going to work them in a similar way using a circular motion. And just like the stones, I'm going to work from the coarse grit to the fine grit. And the finest grit will really shine things up. When you've achieved a nice smooth surface and your enamel transitions to your metal evenly, your pendant is done. I had so much fun with this technique that I used it again in a larger project. I hope you've enjoyed this video and try this project. There are so many different possibilities that you could do to make it your own. Thanks for watching.
Visit our Learning Center at cooltools.us for more cool jewelry making videos. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and be sure to sign up for our email list to be the first to hear about new videos, new products, and other cool stuff from Cool Tools.